Welcome to the Commonwealth Matters. I'm your host, Richard Nelson. Thank you for joining us. On this edition of the Commonwealth Matters, I'm going to unpack the 2024 presidential election. The day before the election, I wrote an analysis as to what could contribute to a Trump victory. And quite frankly, we didn't know who would win. The various polls showed that it was neck and neck. The last week of the polling showed that Kamala Harris was pulling ahead. However, the results were very different. And we saw Trump pull off a major victory with 312 electoral college votes to Kamala Harris's 226. But I thought it'd be helpful to put together an analysis of the factors that could lead to a Trump victory. And I sent this out the day before of the election. And the column was entitled "Voter Anger, Democratic Policy Priorities Could Tip Election to Trump." And that's what I want to talk about on this program. So many of the mainstream media, or legacy media outlets, as I like to call them, were pulling for Kamala Harris. In fact, most of the news coverage, I'm going to talk about this in a few minutes, but most of the coverage was so biased in favor of Harris and was unfair in many regards towards Donald Trump. I thought it'd be helpful to do an assessment as to what the legacy media outlets missed. And because, quite frankly, if Trump won, as he did, many were going to wake up the next morning or early that morning as the results were called, and they were going to find themselves in shock. And so let's go down the list. I've got about a dozen different areas that I want to touch on in this program. Number one, illegal immigration. According to various polls, this was a top 3 issue. Under the Biden-Harris administration, we saw a record number of illegal immigrants pour over the southern border. In many cases, these illegal immigrants were claiming refugee status, and once they did that, they had to be let go. And many are still here. That didn't sit well with many American voters. Listen to what a U.S. House Judiciary report said. This was released back on August the 5th. They said in 3.5 years, the Biden-Harris administration has released more than 5.4 million illegal aliens into the United States, with an additional at least 1.9 million known gotaways escaping into the country. When voters realized that was happening, of course, many of the right-leaning news outlets were reporting this. Left-leaning, the majority of the legacy news media was not reporting this, or they downplayed it. But for the American voters, this was an important issue, and this was unacceptable for the federal government to fail to act to keep illegal immigrants out of the country. Interesting side note is that much of the legacy media outlets conflated immigration, legal immigration, and orderly immigration with opposition to illegal immigration. And I think most Republican voters, most Americans get that. There is a difference. Just because you are for tightening the southern border and keeping out people who shouldn't be here does not mean that you are anti-immigrant or anti-immigration. And the failure of legacy media outlets to make that distinction really was a slap in the face, I think, to the common sense understanding that most Americans have. It was talking down to them, and most Americans did not appreciate it. So immigration, huge issues, in particular illegal immigration. And by the way, the immigration system needs to be reformed in this country. It needs to be streamlined, reformed. We should allow more legal immigrants to come through the front door and not come here illegally. The economy. The economy was the number one issue, according to various polls, for American voters. According to a Pew survey conducted back in September, It was 8 in 10 registered voters, 81%, said that the economy will be very important to their vote in the 2024 presidential election. According to a Gallup poll in September, 52% of voters said that they felt worse off today than 4 years ago. Now, that didn't bode well for the Democratic incumbents, Biden and Vice President Harris, who, by the way, failed to make a case as to how her policies would have been different from a Biden presidency. She did not make a case. And when she did speak, she talked about things that would actually have increased inflation, worsened the economy. For example, she talked about price freezes when it came to groceries. She really didn't have an understanding of what that meant because there was swift reaction from grocers and retailers who they understand the dynamics at the local level of why prices are the way they are. And when the federal government gets involved and has a top-down imposition on dictating prices, it artificially influences and imposes restrictions that only the retailers know and only the consumers can respond to. She backed away from that price freeze policy that she proposed. In the end, she failed to distinguish her candidacy and what her presidency would look like from a Biden presidency who had record inflation going back to almost 40 years. 1980 was when we saw record high inflation in this country under the Carter administration. It was 13% inflation. And that is the third issue here. Inflation was at a record high again, going back to the 1980s, and this was a comparable economic situation, inflationary period to the Carter administration. And here's the deal: when voters feel the pinch in their pocketbook, when they're struggling to pay for basics such as food or clothing or gas, they're gonna say, hey, whatever's happening at the federal level or whoever's in government, it ain't working for us, and we need to change course. And inflation was one of the huge issues, again, top 3 issue that impacted voters and how they voted in the presidential race. So under the Biden-Harris administration, inflation spiked at 8% in 2022. Now it's since decreased. It was just over 3% earlier this year. I think it's at about 3.5% right now. But this is still higher than the Federal Reserve's target. Consumers are still feeling it in their pocketbook. They're struggling to, again, pay for basic needs. The other part of this equation is that wages have not kept up with inflation, which means that purchasing power and the ability of consumers to pay for basic cost of living has decreased. So the trend has been historically that the party in power that presides over a failing economy and that is in the middle of an inflationary period, they will lose office. And that's precisely what happened to Kamala Harris. And this is one of the big factors that contributed to a Donald Trump victory. Let's talk about federal debt. The federal government has a spending problem. I think we all know that. In February 2022, the United States federal government debt surpassed $30 trillion. That's 2 years ago. In 2 years, an additional $5 trillion, that's trillion with a T, was added to the federal debt, bringing the total to just under $36 trillion today. Now, consider this. Some people say, well, what is that? That's not even a real number. How does that affect us? The economy seems to be humming along. But consider this. According to the Federal Reserve, the annualized cost of servicing the debt was $726 billion in July of 2023. In other words, this is the interest that you and I and all the other taxpayers across the country are paying on our federal debt. This is our tax dollars just going to service the debt. And when you have $726 billion just paying the interest, that's $726 billion less that could be spent on other government programs, less spent on national defense, less spent on social safety nets like Social Security and Medicare. And that's a real problem. That is, by the way, 14% of total federal spending. That's $726 billion. By the way, next year, that number of debt servicing is going to go up to $1 trillion. $1 trillion of our taxpayer dollars is going to service our debt. And that simply means that there's less of our tax revenue, tax dollars, that is going to actual government programs and government expenses. Now, here's the challenge. Either the economy needs to significantly grow to increase revenue, or taxes need to increase, or services must be cut. Now, under a Trump administration, the idea is to cut taxes and to ramp up the economy, not just cut taxes, but to cut regulation and the government involvement in entrepreneurs and startup businesses so that they can become more productive, hire more people. And when that happens, more money is coming into federal coffers. And that's what Trump promised when he was on the campaign trail. Moving down the list of issues that contributed to a Republican victory in the 2024 presidential election, public safety. Public safety, particularly in our larger cities, proved to be a top issue of concern for voters. Consider that just in 2022, in Kentucky's largest city, Louisville, Republicans picked up 4 state House seats in traditionally held Democratic districts. And they did so because public safety was an issue. You had crime increase, not just that, but you had riots in 2020 that spun out of control. Riots where people were vandalizing private property, where they were looting businesses. It seemed that the law enforcement community had lost, and the governmental leaders at the local level lost control of their community. Public safety is an issue that Republicans have run on for years, and this resonated with the voters. By the way, Kamala Harris was on record in 2020 on a New York radio station talking about defunding the police. Her running mate, Tim Walz, was the mayor, or I should say the governor of the state of Minnesota, and failed to take action in the when Minneapolis was burning. So that's a problem. If you have government officials failing to protect their communities, and when you see crime run rampant, and when you see violent protests, violent riots, and government leaders don't take action, you will see voters respond at the ballot box. And that's what happened in the 2024 election. Republicans were much stronger when it came to public safety. They were not in favor of defunding the police, and they promised to restore order in communities.
Kentucky is at a crossroads. We can choose to give in to the radical left, or we can choose to engage the culture in a God-honoring way.
I started the Commonwealth Policy Center because I believe that Christians have a responsibility to influence government and society to the glory of God. While the Commonwealth Policy Center's made a significant impact, our work isn't finished. If you'd like to join our movement working for timeless values, then head to our website.
To learn more, go to commonwealthpolicycenter.org.
If you're just joining us, you're tuned in to The Commonwealth Matters. I'm your host, Richard Nelson here, and we are going down a list of significant items and issues that contributed to a Republican victory in the 2024 election. So, gender ideology. The Biden administration elevated transgender identity over the rights of females to private spaces in sports and sports in public schools. I would argue that this is a symbolic democratic political reordering of a healthy society. What do I mean by that? Well, Democrats have embraced this idea that gender is fluid and that it's a personal right to determine your own gender identity, not just for adults, but for children. And for many of Americans, that is a step way too far. Children in particular are still trying to figure out who they are and what life is about. And most Americans agree that children who are very clearly biologically born male or biologically born female, they do not have the capacity to determine their own gender. It's contrary to the biological reality. It's contrary to sociological reality. It's contrary to science. It's anti-science. And most voters saw that. And it becomes a problem when a policy is put in place that threatens young girls in public schools who are going to their restroom or locker room. It threatens the reality that they should have a private space where males are not allowed in. It threatens school sports, women's sports teams. And again, the Biden administration embraced these policies, imposed these policies in K through 12 public schools, and many voters said, no, that's just not right. And this was encouraging to see pushback against far left gender ideology. And there was a clear distinction, by the way, between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. He was very much opposed to gender ideology and allowing biological males to join girls' sports. Kamala Harris was in favor of that. Election integrity, important issue to voters. I don't want to revisit the 2020 election. There's enough that's been talked about there, enough litigation with that. But I want to drill into one important distinction between Republicans and Democrats on the issue of election integrity. And that is that Republicans have proposed and sponsored and enacted, when they've been in a place to do so, policies that would strengthen our election laws. For example, picture ID at the polls, something that Kentucky did a few years ago, where you need to have a photograph of yourself with your address, a government-issued ID, proving that you are actually who you say you are when you go to vote. Democrats have opposed things like that. They call it a burden. They call it onerous. Republicans have supported laws that say if you're not a verifiable U.S. citizen, you shouldn't be on the voter rolls. Democrats have opposed that. They're here in Kentucky. Democrats in the state legislature have said, well, you're anti-immigrant. You're trying to make it more difficult for people to vote. No, that's a common sense provision that most Americans agree with, and it should be made clear, not just in state statute, but in state constitutions. And that was Amendment 1 in Kentucky. It said that you need to be a U.S. citizen to vote in Kentucky elections. That measure, Amendment 1, passed by close to a 2-to-1 margin. That is now part of the state constitution. So, big difference between Democrats and Republicans when it comes to election integrity and strengthening our voter laws. I think of a person in the Kentucky State House, Democratic caucus chair, Sherilyn Stevenson of Lexington, who said this about Amendment 1. She said the reason why it was there was to help drive turnout for Republicans, and that it's a solution in search of a problem that doesn't exist because non-citizens can already vote. It's that kind of response and that kind of attitude towards a common sense measure that turned many people, many voters who may have been in the middle, maybe even some Democrats, turned them away from Democratic candidates and said, that if we have a way to strengthen our election laws and voter ID laws. Let's do it. Let's not play around with it. This is too serious to do so. Well, Sherilyn Stevenson was on the wrong side of that issue, and she ended up losing her seat. She was defeated by a Republican newcomer, Vanessa Grossel. So this is an issue that hurt Democrats at the national level as well. Kamala Harris wasn't for strengthening the election laws. Donald Trump, of course, was, and this played in his favor as well. Let's talk about foreign policy. Former President Donald Trump, President-elect Donald Trump, is taking a very different position than Republicans have traditionally taken when it comes to engaging in foreign conflicts. He is very much opposed to foreign entanglements and to getting close to committing our troops in overseas skirmishes or battles. Right now, the United States is in a proxy war with Russia. We are supporting Ukraine, who's at war with Russia, with all kinds of armaments. The latest news was that we are shipping long-range missiles that could reach into the heart of Russia, purportedly were to help Ukraine. Now stop and think about this for a moment. This is no secret to Russia. It's no secret to the other players in that region of the world. But what does that mean when we're supplying long-range missiles that could reach perhaps as far as Moscow? What does that do to our relationship with Russia? It's provocative. It could lead to Russia striking out in ways that they haven't before. And that's a problem. Well, Donald Trump has vowed to keep us out of foreign wars and foreign entanglements. This played big with a lot of voters, especially young men, because they stand in the way of a draft if we do get entangled in a war. Democrats presided, and President Biden in particular, presided over one of the most disastrous withdrawals in U.S. history in Afghanistan, which left 13 U.S. service members dead, hundreds of U.S. citizens stranded, and billions of dollars in American military hardware and infrastructure left behind. That was an embarrassment. It was a shame. It was disorderly. And that was terrible, what happened. And Joe Biden took ownership of that. Donald Trump promises to keep us out of entanglements like that. And if we do end up withdrawing, to do it in a more orderly way. Foreign trade. Let's talk about that. And we're winding down here. Donald Trump is, along with many Americans, particularly union members, really unhappy with foreign companies dumping their products here at lower prices, undercutting American-made products. And Donald Trump, in response, has promised to slap tariffs on companies that are dumping cheap goods here. So this is an internal discussion in the Republican Party. What will tariffs do to trade? What will it do to the other companies that are producing products, cheap products in their country and then bringing it here? What's it going to do to the consumer? Many people are saying it's going to increase prices to the consumer, but we will see what happens. But foreign trade, it is out of balance, by the way. Our international trade deficit in the United States is about $70 billion last year. And I think what Donald Trump is angling for is a level playing field between American companies and foreign companies. Energy policy, moving right along here. We sit on enough fossil fuels to lower our energy costs at home and to be a major exporter. But however, under the Biden-Harris administration, they've blocked development of America's natural resources. The Trump administration promises to open up more federal lands to drilling, which is going to bring energy prices down for all Americans. But it will also bring about energy independence and economic growth. When we have cheap energy here, it fuels the factories and the businesses that are depending on cheap and reliable energy. Let's move on to DEI and anti-Semitism. Democrats have embraced in various institutions, academic, corporate, in politics, they've embraced diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. This is counter to the American ideal of meritocracy. These policies look at outward characteristics, race, and ethnicity instead of the content of character, instead of ability. It hinders a level playing field when it comes to competence, when it comes to ability. And this is something Democrats have embraced, Republicans have opposed. Anti-Semitism, we saw this last year, ugly anti-Semitism on college campuses. And that's an offshoot of DEI and just how extreme the left has become. One of my disappointments, one of my observations is that the legacy media outlets really didn't cover just how ugly and how serious the anti-Semitism was on our major college campuses. This came back to hurt Democratic candidates and especially Kamala Harris. So these are the reasons why I believe we have Donald Trump as our next president and why Republicans are in power in Washington, D.C. And there you have it. I've got more information on the Commonwealth Policy Center website. Go to commonwealthpolicycenter.org and you can find out more analysis there. And we're out of time, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. May God bless you, and tune in next time to the Commonwealth Matters.